So now that we know a little bit about atoms and molecules and elements, we're going to look at how they work together to help a living organism function. So biochemical compounds are carbon-based compounds that are found in living organisms. So the reason that it's important for you to know that they're carbon-based is because carbon has the ability to form very, very large compounds. And the reason for that is because each atom of carbon can form 4 chemical bonds with other atoms. They can even bond with itself. And this allows it to create these really large molecules. A chemical bond is when atoms share electrons between atoms. So, and this sharing holds the chemical compounds together. It's kind of like holding hands or linking elbows or somehow staying connected. And so biochemical compounds make up all the cells and tissues of all living things, and they're involved in all life processes. And there happen to be 4 classes of these biochemical compounds: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And so we're going to take a closer look at all of these now. So starting off with carbohydrates, this table tells you the main elements found in carbohydrates, examples of carbohydrates, and what their functions or what their jobs are. And so carbs include sugar, starch, glycogen, and cellulose. They provide energy to cells. It stores energy. So sugars provide energy. Starch stores energy in plants. Glycogen stores energy in animals. And cellulose makes up the cell wall of plants. So the second class of biochemical compounds would be proteins. Examples of proteins include enzymes, and enzymes' jobs are to speed up chemical reactions. And then another example of a protein is a hormone, and the hormone's job is to regulate life processes. Next we have lipids. Lipids include fats, oils, and phospholipids, and they each have specific jobs. Fats store energy in animals. Oils store energy in plants. And phospholipids make up cell membranes. And if you remember, cell membranes are like the skin around all cells. Nucleic acids, there's 2 main types. We have DNA and RNA. DNA stores genetic information in cells, where RNA helps make proteins. And so from this table, we're going to go into even more detail about each of these. So all biochemical compounds contain hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. You maybe noticed that in the table on the previous slides. But they can also contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and or sulfur. They can create polymers. Polymers are large molecules that consist of many smaller repeating molecules. And the monomers are these smaller repeating molecules. So monomers make up polymers. So, and that kind of makes sense if you think about the prefix mono. Mono means one, and poly means many. So a lot of one thing can build up to make many things. And so we call these macromolecules when they contain up to maybe thousands of monomers chained together. So carbohydrates are a biochemical compound that includes sugar, starch, glycogen, and cellulose. Again, we can get that from that table. Sugars are considered simple carbohydrates, and glucose is the smallest of all sugar molecules. So what's kind of new to you guys is to maybe understand or learn that there's a lot of different sugars. So there's many different types of sugars. And they're all very similar in their chemical structure, but there's just little changes that make them be different types of sugars. Most sugars when you look at their name, like glucose, end in OSE. So another type of sugar that you maybe have heard of is fructose, as in like no high fructose corn syrup. So the OSE indicates or is a hint that you're talking about a sugar. Plants and some organisms, other organisms, can make glucose through the process of photosynthesis. And so glucose is a basic building block of carbohydrates. So starches, where sugars are simple, starches are complex carbohydrates. Their polymers are hundreds of glucose molecules chained together. So it would be glucose after glucose after glucose. Plants make starches to store their extra glucose, and consumers then get starches by eating the plants. So when we eat a salad with lettuce, we get the plant's starch or its stored energy. The human digestive system breaks down the starches into the sugars. So instead of glucose connected to glucose connected to glucose, we end up getting a glucose molecule with another glucose molecule separated with another glucose molecule. So the starches is the complex chain into the simple sugars of them being individualized. And our cells can actually use those sugars for energy. If we have too much sugar or too many glucose molecules, we can chain them back together and rearrange this chain to make a complex carbohydrate that we call glycogen. Glycogen is also a polymer of glucose, where we have a glucose chain to a glucose, chain to a glucose, chain to a glucose. However, it's a different polymer than starch, and it's just how the atoms get rearranged that makes them different. Your image over here shows you example of carbohydrates or food that has carbohydrates in them. Potatoes, cereal, bread, and pasta are big storage units of carbohydrates. Cellulose is again a complex carbohydrate, and this is found in plants. Again, it's a polymer of glucose. So when you see something's a polymer of glucose, you know it's just glucose after glucose after glucose after glucose. Cellulose molecules will bundle together to form long, tough fibers. And this is the most abundant biochemical compound on Earth. And it's found primarily in the cell walls of plants. And it gives them support to the stems and tree trunks to make them really rigid and able to stand up vertically. Second class of biochemical compounds that we're going to talk about are proteins. And proteins consist of one or more chains of small molecules called amino acids. And so amino acids are the monomers of proteins. There are only 20 different types of amino acids, but the way that they chain together and the order in which they chain together can create many different types of proteins. The order of the amino acids and the number will determine the protein shape, and the shape will then determine function. And oftentimes, these protein shapes are very, very complex. So, like I said, protein shape determines functions. Proteins are used to make up your muscle tissues. They can speed up chemical reactions. They regulate life processes. I think the table that showed you that those were called hormones. These they called enzymes. They can help defend against infections, so they're part of the immune system. And they can transport materials around the body in the blood. So proteins are very important for life. Hemoglobin is an example of a protein that is a transporter. It transports protein in the blood. The heme side of this molecule will bind to the oxygen. So right here is your heme side, and it will bind to oxygen. Each red blood cell has hundreds of hemoglobin molecules found in it, and each hemoglobin can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. And you can see that the yellow oxygen is binding into that heme structure, and then it will carry it throughout the body to deliver oxygen to various parts of the body. Third, we have lipids, and these are used to store energy and to make cell membranes. There are 2 types of lipids. We have fats and oils, 3, fats, oils, and phospholipids. Solid lipids found in animals are referred to as fats, and liquid lipids are found in plants, and these are called oils, like olive oil and corn syrup. Olives come from plants, corn comes from plants. And phospholipids will contain the element phosphorus, hence the phospholipids. And this is a component that makes up the cell membrane of living things. Lipids are very long chains called fatty acids, and they're almost only made up of carbon and hydrogen. And these fatty acids can be saturated or unsaturated. A saturated fatty acid has carbon atoms bonded to as many hydrogen atoms as possible. And this is what we find in fats. So if you can look down here, this example right here is of a saturated fatty acid. And if you notice that for every carbon, except this last one, they're only bonded to hydrogen atoms. This last one does get bonded to oxygen, but it is bonded to as many hydrogens as possible. Unsaturated will have usually what we call a double bond between 2 carbons. So these carbons aren't bonded to as many hydrogens as possible. And so this double bond makes this overall structure have a little bend to it. And so this prevents it from solidifying, and these are found in oils. Lastly, we have nucleic acids. They are the last group of biochemical compounds that include RNA and DNA. If you notice the NA in both DNA and RNA, they stand for nucleic acid. And nucleic acids are made up of nucleotides. And a nucleotide has 3 parts. It has a phosphate group, it has a sugar, and then it has a nitrogen base. So there are 4 possible nitrogen bases, and they are listed over here. So 4 possible nitrogen bases for DNA. They include adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. When we look at comparing our nucleic acids of DNA and RNA, you will find that instead of 2 chains, so this one has 2 blue chains, that's an image of DNA. DNA has 2 strands, where RNA will only have 1 chain or 1 strand. The nitrogen bases on the 2 chains will form bonds together. So right here, the 2 bases are bonding together, and the bonded bases are referred to as base pairs. So what you'll notice right here is that we have adenine next to thymine, and they will always pair together, whereas down here we have guanine next to cytosine, and those 2 will always pair together. And it's those bonds between the base pairs that hold the 2 chains of DNA together. So DNA's job is to store genetic information in the cells of all living things. This contains our genetic code, and we'll talk a lot more about the genetic code in a few more videos, but their job of the genetic code is to pretty much have the instructions on how to make proteins, and these instructions are coded based on the order of nitrogen bases. RNA then is used to copy and interpret the genetic code. RNA is kind of like the decoder of these instructions. So now that we've looked at the 4 types of biochemical compounds, we're going to look at how they react. So a chemical reaction is a process in which some substance, the reactant, will change chemically into a brand new substance that we call the products. And so we use this in biology with our biochemical reactions. So remember, the prefix bio means life. So these are chemical reactions of life. Living things depend on biochemical reactions for more than just energy. Every function and structure of a living organism depends on thousands of biochemical reactions taking place in every single one of our cells. And so we call this our metabolism, the sum of all of the organism's biochemical reactions. And there are 2 types of reactions, basic reactions involved in metabolism. You can have catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. Catabolic reactions involve breaking larger molecules into smaller ones. This releases energy. An example would be it should be this example up here because it's breaking down. And our example should be switched. And so I think of catabolic like a catastrophe. A catastrophe usually destroys something, and when it does so, it releases a lot of energy. Anabolic reactions involve taking small molecules and combining them to form larger ones, and this can only happen if there's energy present. So that would be to build a starch from the sugars. So remember when we talked about your starch being a whole bunch of glucoses bonded together? The catabolic reaction breaks them apart into individual sugars, and anabolic is the exact opposite. You have your 3 sugars that are individual, and they will bond together to form one big molecule or one big starch. Enzymes are special types of proteins that increase the rate of a biochemical reaction. Without enzymes, chemical reactions could take up to years to actually finish, and by that point, the organism would be dead. So enzymes are very important in that they speed up that process. The nice thing about enzyme is that they can be reused over and over again. They don't get burned up in a chemical reaction. And they're very specific. Enzyme A will only work for reaction A. Enzyme B will only work for reaction B. They are lock and key kind of specific. So lastly, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are examples of your anabolic and catabolic reactions. Photosynthesis is the process in which producers capture light energy from the sun to make glucose, whereas cellular respiration, we take energy in which energy is released from glucose and stored in smaller amounts in other molecules that cells can use for energy. So this is catabolic because it's releasing energy and we're making smaller molecules. Photosynthesis is where we're making a larger molecule from a smaller molecule.